Tantor Audio presents The Summit, Bretton Woods, 1944. J.M. Keynes and the Reshaping of the Global Economy. By Ed Conway. Narrated by Ralph Lister. Prologue. Saturday the 22nd of July, 1944. It wasn't until dinner was about to be served that the assembled guests realized someone was missing. The dining hall was already packed with delegates. The majority of them were formally dressed in ties or bow ties, though if you looked closely, you'd soon notice the bags under their eyes and the slow gait born of sleep deprivation. Everyone was exhausted. For 3 weeks they'd been negotiating, by turns remonstrating and reveling with each other in the conference rooms, corridors and bars of the hotel. Most had worked through the nights in a desperate bid to close a deal in time. And this was it. Bretton Woods' final act, the closing banquet and plenary session, where it would be revealed whether the most ambitious economic negotiations in history had been a success. For it was far from assured, even with only a couple of hours left, that the conference would end in triumph. The Russians were still refusing to sign. They had spent the past week stubbornly contesting the terms under which they would participate. Rumour had it that Stalin himself had ordered his representatives to stand firm against the Americans. The uncertainty had cast a shadow over the event. After 3 weeks of near 24-hour working days, which in turn had followed months and years of behind-the-scenes preparation, the conference looked as though it would end in discord. That said, merely getting this far was an achievement in itself. The world's leading economic minds had travelled from every corner of the globe, many of them dodging attack on the way. One delegate had even come straight from a prisoner-of-war camp. The outcome of the war itself was as yet uncertain. British and American troops had landed in Normandy for Operation Overlord only a few weeks before. In the Pacific, Japan occupied most of the contested territories and had only just lost control of Thailand. Momentum was going the Allies' way, but even in a best-case scenario, the conflict would not be over for some time. Moreover, nothing of the scale and ambition of Bretton Woods had been achieved before. The objective was self-consciously grand: to replace the mangled global monetary system responsible for the Great Depression, and, by extension, for the war, with something that worked. No one had ever successfully modified the international monetary system. Instead, it had evolved incrementally. From the early days of mercantilism to the British Empire-dominated gold standard, which collapsed in 1914, through to the flimsy system of currencies and rules erected after the Great Depression in the 1930s. All previous efforts to achieve what the delegates were attempting had failed, without exception. Devising a comprehensive new system of governing the world economy was challenge enough, even before one stopped to consider whether it could actually be implemented. For a spectre hung over the Bretton Woods Conference, that of the Peace Summit in Paris 25 years before. There, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the world's leaders had agreed upon a deal which they thought would secure a lasting peace throughout Europe. In the event, it had merely sown the seeds of the Second World War. Imposing reparations on Germany had served to fuel resentment both in Berlin and among the French and British, who claimed the largest amounts. Nor did the leaders even countenance trying to tackle the broader economic mess left behind by the collapse of the gold standard. To add to the general discord, the Americans had consigned the League of Nations to irrelevance by refusing to join. They had shown scant regard for the sporadic conferences the League sponsored in the interwar period, aimed at repairing the world economy. Here at Bretton Woods, the task was not merely to design an entirely new set of monetary rules, but to show that for the first time the US really would engage. Bretton Woods was to be the litmus test of whether 20th century internationalism could really work, clearing the path for the foundation of the United Nations the following year. That, at least, was the official ambition. But had you asked each delegation what they wanted out of the conference, you would have received a host of conflicting answers. For the US, this was the moment to demonstrate their rise to the status of the world's undisputed superpower. Britain's twin aims were to ensure the survival of as much of the empire as possible, while reducing their enormous wartime debts. The Mexicans were desperate that silver would play a part in the world's new economic system. No prizes for guessing their biggest precious metal export. The French wanted to be recognized as a sovereign economic state. And the Russians? Well, by the beginning of the final dinner, it looked as if they had turned up purely to sabotage the deal. For many, the best that could be hoped for from this banquet and closing plenary session was that somehow Henry Morgenthau, the US Treasury Secretary, could put a positive spin on the quandary. But some members of his delegation had privately conceded that failure to secure Russian involvement would represent a failure of the conference. Predictably, the row with the Soviets had centered on money, specifically how much the Russians would contribute to the new system of global economic management. And the mood had soured in the past 24 hours, as it emerged that despite their politeness and genuine engagement in the sessions, the Russians were unwilling to budge. To add to the delegates' worries, meanwhile, even the Australians, who had seemed to be in favour of the agreement, hadn't been granted permission by Canberra to sign up, with only an hour to go until that final dinner. This was as much as most of the delegates knew as they filed into the dining room. Despite the hotel's best efforts to keep numbers manageable, hundreds had turned up that night. Bleary-eyed delegates, lobbyists, the local great and the good, journalists, and even the odd gatecrasher. The only people assured of a seat were the big names, the chairmen of the delegations, who had taken their places at the high table, at least all but one of them. Not every Allied country was represented at Bretton Woods. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had insisted on involving the Big Four, the US, Britain, the Soviet Union, and China. But who should come along with them was up for debate. And as with so much else at Bretton Woods, even this had turned into a battle of influence between the British and the Americans. The British regarded the Latin Americans and the Chinese as entirely craven before the US. The Americans suspected the British had undue influence over the Greeks and Indians. In the end, the delegations were whittled down to 44, though that was still a few too many for the British, who considered the whole enterprise variously a monstrous monkey house, a Tower of Babel. And there were considerable language issues. Officially, at least, the conference language was English, but some of the delegates insisted on speaking in their mother tongue. The chairman of the French delegation, Pierre Mendès France, would happily converse with other delegates in fluent English when they bumped into each other in the corridor, but as soon as the microphones were switched on in the committee rooms, he flipped back into French. Nonetheless, that was one step better than the Russian representative, Mikhail Stepanov, who couldn't speak a word of English. But what he and his team lacked in linguistic proficiency, they made up for in their superhuman consumption of alcohol. Almost every evening they were to be found in the hotel's underground bar and nightclub, knocking back spirits and trying enthusiastically to communicate with their foreign counterparts, until that proved too much effort and they burst into Russian folk songs. The Soviet delegates' days were even more fraught. They and their interpreters spent half their time straining to understand the complex terms being hammered out in the plenary sessions, and the other half trying desperately to confer with Moscow. As one of the delegates later recalled, I could not help feeling that they were struggling between the firing squad on the one hand and the English language on the other. Grasp of the English language was less of a problem for Daddy Kung, the head of the Chinese delegation. H. Kung, full name Kung Shangxi, had studied at Yale and spent much of his life at various points between the US and China. Eventually, after the communists overthrew the nationalist government, he would move back to the US and live out his final days a few hours from Bretton Woods, in upstate New York. One of the conference's biggest characters, literally and figuratively, the rotund, genial fellow, was a distant descendant of Confucius and the richest man in China. An outside observer might reasonably have assumed that his real aim at Bretton Woods was to throw the most lavish parties. Remodeling the world economy, so far as it seemed, was something best left to his advisers, who actually engaged with the negotiations. For most of the conference, Morgenthau took a similar stance, leaving the grunt work to his deputy, Harry Dexter White, who boasted that he scarcely had more than 5 hours rest a night for the entire conference. But tonight it was Morgenthau himself, the head of the US delegation and honorary president of the conference, who took centre stage. He had sent round word for the dinner and plenary to be brought forward by half an hour, so he could broadcast his final speech live to the nation. Which is why there were eyebrows raised about that empty seat. All of the other major representatives, including Kung, Stepanov, Mendes-France, and the Canadian delegation head J.L. Ilsley, were now seated around Morgenthau. Late on Wednesday, 3 nights earlier, John Maynard Keynes had been taken ill as he bounded up the stairs after a meeting with Morgenthau. They had been arguing about a relatively minor element of the negotiations, whether or not the Bank for International Settlements should be dismantled, when Keynes had dashed up to his room on the second floor of the hotel. He collapsed shortly afterwards. It was well known that the head of the British delegation had been in poor health. For more than half a decade, he had suffered from bacterial endocarditis, an infection of the heart valves which sapped his energy and left him at risk of heart attacks. He had already suffered a series of attacks, so arrangements at the conference had been geared towards preventing the recurrence of something like this. Rather than flying across the Atlantic, he had sailed. He left much of the late-night work to his colleagues and tried to resist the temptation to stay out and socialize. Even so, his was an arduous schedule. "The pressure of work here has been quite unbelievable," he wrote in a letter home. This is unsurprising, given the time frame within which the conference was attempting to devise an unprecedented set of new rules for international economics. True, the fundamentals of the system had been hammered out in the previous months, but securing agreement on the technical terms with 44 countries to please was turning out to be a superhuman challenge. Within a few hours, word of Keynes's collapse had spread downstairs to the bar. Journalists presumed he had suffered a heart attack on his way up that staircase. Reuters reported that he had died. Panic spread through the hotel. That was Wednesday night, and by the time of the banquet, 3 days later, few had since caught sight of the grand old man of economics. Rumour had it that he was back on his feet, but then again, there was that empty chair staring ominously at the delegates as they sat and waited for the food to be served. Perhaps the most important single figure at the conference, J.M. Keynes stood, more than anyone else, for what Bretton Woods was about. He had been there in Paris in 1919. He was the man who predicted with eerie prescience the breakdown of the Versailles Treaty in his international best-selling pamphlet, The Economic Consequences of the Peace. Hero worshipped by economists and philosophers around the world, he could scarcely move from one meeting room to another at the conference without being accosted by yet another admirer seeking advice or pearls of wisdom. Keynes was a genuine international celebrity, the only household name at Bretton Woods, save perhaps for renowned magician Cardini, who had inexplicably appeared in the hotel bar one night to entertain delegates with his illusions. He was instrumental in the Allied war effort. The Reuters report of his alleged death was celebrated on the front pages in Germany. And not only was Keynes the chairman of one of the Big Four delegations, he was the joint author of a significant chunk of the Bretton Woods proposals. The symbolism of Keynes's role was not lost on his fellow delegates. Here was the man who had foreseen World War II, leading us towards a settlement which would prevent World War III. His collapse had shaken everyone. As one of his colleagues wrote, "I now feel that it is a race between the exhaustion of his powers and the termination of the conference." Keynes's battle wasn't merely with his health. In conference rooms on both sides of the Atlantic, he had also been fighting the American delegation throughout the negotiations. And in these clashes, he had come up against a stubborn opponent in the form of White, a rather obscure 51-year-old from the US Treasury. White was everything Keynes was not. Where Keynes was 6'6" tall, White was short and stocky. Keynes was part of the British establishment, a member of the House of Lords. White was a self-made man from the rough side of the tracks in Boston. Keynes was a self-publicist, frequently courting the press when he wasn't writing for it. White was one of those shy fellows who wears a loud tie in an attempt to express his colourful side. He relished his privacy and never wrote a major work, save for his doctoral thesis. Keynes had been a conscientious objector in the First World War. White served in the trenches in France. They were the odd couple of international economics, and for much of the time their relationship had been rocky, caustic, and occasionally aggressive. The pair would shout at each other in meetings, bully each other in an attempt to get their way, and afterwards abuse their rival to their friends. And yet, despite their differences, this odd couple also had much in common. Both were irreverent outsiders. Both were brilliant. Both rubbed their colleagues up the wrong way. President Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill had respectively appointed White and Keynes out of necessity rather than choice. Because none of their colleagues really knew how to deal with them, both were given rather vague positions and unusual autonomy, something which would later destroy White's career. And, to a level almost unheard of today, despite being unelected advisers, both overshadowed the finance ministers they were officially serving. And what they had come up with together was a blueprint for a world economy that looked as if it might just work. However, the Bretton Woods system would face discredit from the very beginning if the meeting was to end in the kind of discord the Russians were threatening. The view from the great windows of the dining hall was as majestic as ever. As the diners took their seats, the room was suddenly flooded with light. As if answering to some almighty cue, the clouds that had hung over the summit of Mount Washington throughout the day suddenly lifted. Pale evening light glinted off the peak. If you'd cast your eyes down from the top of the mountain into the valley that enclosed Bretton Woods, you would have spotted the serene fairways of the golf course, the flags fluttering on the greens, and then, close enough that you could hear it, the brook that ran by the hotel itself. The delegates sat down to see whether they really were about to make history. The phrase, history in the making, is bandied around so often that it has lost most of its potency. But when the delegates turned up to the Mount Washington Hotel in the summer of 1944, they were under no delusions that that was precisely what they were doing. Their task was breathtakingly ambitious. Nothing less than to repair the world economy by fashioning a system whereby countries could trade with each other without the threat of financial and economic crises like the ones which had punctuated the 1920s and 1930s. On their shoulders was the responsibility of ensuring that their countrymen would never again face either mass unemployment or economic deprivation, both of which might lead them back to war against each other. The system they created is regarded by many economists as a remarkable success. Indeed, the very name Bretton Woods is now used as political and economic shorthand for something very simple: real economic recovery. Only a handful of the men and women who travelled up to New Hampshire that summer were widely known outside their bureaucracies. There were no heads of state, though no fewer than 7 delegates would go on to be presidents and prime ministers of their respective countries. They were, as far as the public was concerned, anonymous technicians and negotiators. What was more, neither of the 2 lead players in the drama, White and Keynes, was in charge of his country's finance department. Keynes wasn't even a paid official. Though journalists walked the corridors of the Mount Washington alongside them, and though there were occasional intrusions from domestic politics, the delegates were granted remarkable freedom simply to get on with things. With the press and public fixated on the V1 attacks and the Normandy landings, whereby Allied troops were embarking on the campaign to reclaim mainland Europe, Keynes and White managed to work under the radar. The 2 representatives had a unique degree of independence to create a blueprint for running the world economy. They were helped by the fact that then, as now, the workings of the international monetary system are rarely front-page news until they go horribly wrong. However, the rules and agreements on how exchange rates interact, how money flows from one country to another, and how central banks set interest rates are the very bedrock of how our economies function. Ever since the first civilizations began trading with each other millennia ago, swapping coins for goods, there has been an international monetary system. And while other economic issues, unemployment, incomes, the behavior of bankers and businessmen, have always hogged the headlines, their root causes can often be traced back to the behavior of the system. It had been thus in the early 20th century, when the gold standard frayed, triggering an economic chain reaction, hyperinflation in Austria and Germany, European financial collapse, trade wars, and so on, that culminated in the Great Depression and the Second World War. It was thus in 2008 and thereafter, when imbalances between countries in surplus and those in deficit, whether America versus China or Germany versus Greece, caused build-ups of debt which in turn contributed both to a global financial crisis and to the near collapse of the euro. Today's global monetary apparatus, with its floating exchange rates and free movement of money across borders, may feel like an inevitable part of the economic furniture. Not only is it relatively young, its very existence is a consequence of a series of accidents, of crises, and of short-term political decisions that turned permanent. This book is, in one sense, an economic history of the past century. Over that period, the characters in this book changed the international monetary system beyond recognition, and changed our lives in the process. But Bretton Woods sits at its very centre for a simple reason, and not merely because it happened midway through the 20th century. The system mapped out by the delegates to the Mount Washington in those 3 weeks in 1944 permitted the longest period of stability and economic growth in history. Its protagonists laid the firm foundations the global economy had been missing since the collapse of the gold standard in 1914. The institutions these men and women created, the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, are as important today as they were upon their creation. For a brief period of a couple of decades after the conference, the world economy grew at a faster rate than either under the gold standard or in the more recent modern era between the late 1970s and 2008. The incidence of financial crises was lower than ever before. Fewer banks failed. Imbalances, in other words trade surpluses and deficits, were smaller. Over the same period, inflation was low and the income gap between the rich and the poor remained narrow. There is no such thing as a perfect economic system, but based on its performance, many economists still argue that Bretton Woods was as close as the global economy has ever come to it. Others maintain that stability and economic health during this period was due to other factors, that the system behaved very differently from how the men and women meeting at the Mount Washington anticipated. Some argue that Bretton Woods merely stored up problems that exploded in its wake. Whatever you believe, however, and this being economics, there will never be a definitive answer, Bretton Woods remains the only time countries ever came together to remold the world's monetary system. And for a tantalizing couple of decades, it seemed to work. But while the IMF and the World Bank live on, the actual system they oversaw, the rules hammered out in 1944 to lay down how different nations should interact economically, is long dead. In 1971, his country's finances straining under the cost of the Vietnam War, Richard Nixon hammered the final nail into Bretton Woods' coffin. The system had been under strain for some time, but when the president ended the link between the US dollar and gold, the international monetary system was changed forever. From that moment, the value of a country's banknotes was linked not to a reference point, be it gold, silver, or even the international currency called Bancor, which Keynes tried and failed to create at Bretton Woods, but to pure trust. Some would nickname this system Bretton Woods II, but in reality it was drastically different from its predecessor. Since 1971, we have been living in an era of what is called fiat money, where a currency's value depends on the trust investors have in its issuer. To some economists, this is as it should be. Many are grateful that there are no longer universal controls on the flow of money from one country to another, as there were for much of the post-war period. But, expedient and economically elegant though it might have seemed to rid the world of Bretton Woods, there are more troubling correlations since its demise. After 1971, the gap between rich and poor started to widen abruptly. The world has become ever more dominated by the financial industry. The imbalances between debtor and creditor countries have ballooned to unprecedented levels. Economic life has been punctuated with spells of high inflation and sporadic financial crises. Little surprise that for many politicians at least, Bretton Woods stands for a return to a more ordered world, where there are clearly defined rules about how countries interact with each other economically. It stands for a moment when economists finally took control of a chaotic financial system and wrung some sense into it. No wonder so many politicians want another such agreement, however futile and misguided such an aspiration may be. Easy as it is to cast Bretton Woods as a symbol of an economic nirvana, the reality was rather messier. The agreements that emerged were far from perfect. They bore the scars of a difficult birth. There were clauses inserted to please certain countries, others omitted to prevent delegates from storming out. The 3 weeks delegates spent in New Hampshire in July 1944 were remarkable not for their order and predictability, but for their chaos, epitomized by the uncertainty evident as the conference entered its final hours. Indeed, as delegates made their weary way home from the US, more than a few had serious misgivings about the way the conference ended, and about whether the agreement would ever be fully implemented. And indeed, the system that was eventually created would function quite differently from the templates drawn up by White and Keynes. It is the aim of this book to describe what really happened in those remarkable 22 days. And, of course, the months and years of surrounding meetings and behind-the-scenes debates that are equally intriguing. For some reason, while it remains one of economics' few household names, Bretton Woods is frequently ignored in accounts of the period. It is not altogether difficult to understand why. It is all too easy to dismiss international monetary economics as esoteric and irrelevant, rather than, as it is, the gel that bonds countries together. Moreover, most of the delegates responsible continued to be obscure figures who might, at best, feature in passing in economic histories or biographies. It is remarkable that 70 years on, there is still so much left to be discovered about Bretton Woods. There have been a number of books about the conference, from Richard Gardner's 1956 Sterling Dollar Diplomacy to Ben Stiles' 2013 Battle of Bretton Woods, and yet all of them have tended to focus far more on the economics than the sheer human drama of what happened at the Mount Washington. They have tended to draw on a relatively narrow series of sources, and have focused almost exclusively on the struggle between Britain and the United States. Astonishingly, despite the significant role played by Russia in the conference, since the opening of the former Soviet archives to researchers in the wake of the ending of the Cold War, no one had even consulted the key finance ministry files on the Soviet part in Bretton Woods until the writing of this book. Even among the British and American delegates, many personal recollections, diaries and accounts of the conference are published here for the first time. In broader works about the Second World War, Bretton Woods is usually ignored in favour of the summits at Yalta and Potsdam, its legacy overshadowed by the Marshall Plan. This is greatly to underplay its significance. It is not merely that Bretton Woods was the first major deal struck in the attempt to construct the post-war world, nor indeed that alongside the Marshall Plan it helped foster the reconstruction of Europe and the phoenix-like revival of Japan. It is not even that the deal was the first substantive move towards the multilateral post-war world, where countries come together to talk in international institutions. It is not just the intriguing geopolitics, with Russia yet to construct a coherent international economic policy, or the surprising level of influence wielded by China, Brazil and India, countries that would not impose themselves again on the global stage for several more decades. It is not only that it provides a glimpse of what US-Soviet cooperation might have looked like, were it not for the onset of the Cold War a couple of years later. It is not just the fact that this marked the moment the United States officially took the mantle of global economic superpower. Nor, finally, is it merely that the issues grappled with in New Hampshire still haunt the world economy today. It is also something far simpler. Bretton Woods is a gripping tale. Few today remember the conference's nail-biting climax. Few recall that during those 3 weeks of discussions, and indeed in the months that followed, bankers from New York took outrageous steps to try to destroy the agreement. Few remember that the original seed for what became Bretton Woods came not from Britain or America, but from Nazi Germany.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?